Top 5 Most Recent Active and Unidentified American Serial Killers. Number 1. The Little Rock Slasher. Location: Little Rock, Arkansas. Known active years: 2020 to 2021. Suspect description: 6 feet tall, young black man with slender build. On the 24th of August 2021, 64-year-old Larry Eugene McChristian was found stabbed to death on a neighbor's porch after being reported missing 2 days prior. When police looked at the neighbor's surveillance footage, it was discovered that McChristian, who had been walking alone, had been stabbed once by a suspect who returned a short while later to stab him again. On the 23rd of September 2021, 62-year-old Jeff Welch was found by his friend slumped over on his porch with puncture wounds on his neck, and an autopsy revealed that his death was a homicide. On the 11th of April 2021, 41-year-old Deborah Walker was walking home when a stranger ran up to her and stabbed her 15 times and left her to bleed out. Fortunately, Walker was taken to a hospital in time to save her life. Unfortunately, less than 24 hours later, a 40-year-old homeless man named Marlon Anthony Franklin was found stabbed to death less than a block away from where Walker had been attacked. Although Walker was able to give a suspect description, the serial killer is still at large. Before we continue, hit the subscribe button. Number 2. The Chicago Strangler. Location: Chicago, Illinois. Known active years: 2001 to 2021. Suspect description: likely male. The Chicago Strangler's earliest known victim was a woman named Angela Ford, who vanished in 1999 only to be found days later strangled and unconscious. She was in a coma until 2001 when she died. In 2007, 2 women named Teresa Bunn and Hazel Lewis were found strangled to death, stripped and set alight in dumpsters within 48 hours of each other. 47 other women in Chicago have fallen victim to the Chicago Strangler, with the most recent one being reported in 2021. Nearly 50% of the victims had a history of sex work, and around 75% were black women. All were between the ages of 18 and 58. All of the victims' remains are dumped outdoors in alleyways or near abandoned buildings. The victims are always strangled and partially or fully stripped before being dumped. Whilst most think that these 51 unsolved murders are the work of a serial killer, Chicago police have been reluctant to blame them on just one killer. Be that as it may, whoever is behind all these murders is still at large. Number 3. The Memphis Serial Murderer. Location: South Memphis, Tennessee. Known active years: 2011 to 2015. Suspect description: 24-year-old black man with cornrows. In January of 2011, in South Memphis, the body of 31-year-old Tamakia McKinney, a possible sex worker, was found shot to death near a cemetery at 2:15 a.m. About a month later, 28-year-old sex worker Jessica Lewis was found shot to death at 12:05 a.m. near the same cemetery. Just 4 days later, at the same location at 5:45 a.m., 44-year-old Rhonda Wells was also found shot to death. 2 days later, 26-year-old Katrina Peterson was also shot, but she managed to run to safety and was taken to hospital, where she ultimately survived and gave police a description of the shooter. In September of 2015, a 25-year-old Juanita Gilmore was found stabbed to death in a cemetery, and it is believed that it was the work of the same serial killer but using a different MO. This serial killer is still at large. Number 4. The Long Island Serial Killer. Location: Long Island, New York. Known active years: 1996 to 2010. Suspect description: none. In early May 2010, a 24-year-old sex worker named Shannon Gilbert made a panicked 911 call which lasted 23 minutes and in which she was heard running, banging on doors for help, and afterwards saying, "They are trying to kill me." She had just come from a client's house in Oak Beach, but after that she was never seen alive again. Her disappearance prompted a search for her in the area, but it wasn't until December that remains were found. They were not Gilbert's remains, however, but those of Maureen Brainard, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. 4 months later, the remains of Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains had been discovered 8 years earlier in another area, were discovered along the same road as the others. The same search then unearthed the remains of an unidentified female toddler, an unidentified Asian person, and Valerie Mack, whose partial remains had also been found over a decade earlier. They then found the remains of 2 unidentified women, one of which was the mother of the unidentified toddler. Gilbert's remains were discovered last in December of 2011. Because of the similarities in the causes of death and where the remains were found, the police believe that this is the work of one serial killer who lives in Long Island. John Betroff, a carpenter from Long Island, is suspected of the murders and has been convicted of killing 2 other sex workers, but there is not yet enough evidence that he is the Long Island serial killer. Thus, the Long Island serial killer is still at large. Before we continue, hit the subscribe button. Number 5. The West Mesa Bone Collector. Location: Albuquerque, New Mexico. Known active years: 2001 to 2005. Suspect description: Central American man. On the 2nd of February 2009, Christine Ross was walking her dog Ruka around the West Mesa when Ruka bounded off and returned with a human leg bone. Ross called the police, who eventually unearthed the remains of 11 mostly Hispanic women between the ages of 15 and 32 and 1 fetus. This is believed to be the work of a serial killer who is linked to a sex trafficking ring and who targeted mostly sex workers or women involved with drugs. Whilst anonymous tips have been given to the authorities, no one has yet been charged, so this serial killer is still at large. Top 5 Recent American Serial Killers. Number 5. Sean Michael Great, 2006 to 2016. Sean Michael Great was born in Ohio in 1976. Great was said to have had a normal childhood until the age of 11, when after his parents divorced, his mother abandoned him and his siblings to go live with a man in Kentucky. This affected Great negatively, and he is said to have started harboring dark and murderous fantasies about his mother. In 2006, Great killed a young mother of 2 who was only identified as Dana Nicole Lowry 13 years later when Great admitted to murdering her after his arrest. He then strangled a woman named Rebecca Lacey to death after she, according to him, stole $4 from him. Her remains were only discovered in 2015, and until Great's confession, her death had been ruled as a drug overdose. The body of Elizabeth Griffith was found a month after Great was arrested, and her autopsy revealed that Great had strangled her to death. On the 13th of September 2016, an unnamed woman called 911 to report that she had been kidnapped and was being held hostage and sexually assaulted by Great. She had managed to make that call whilst Great was asleep, before he had had a chance to murder her. Her call led to Great's arrest. Upon his arrest, the remains of Stacy Hicks were found in the house that he lived in. Stacy was strangled to death. On the same day he was arrested, Great also led police to the remains of his ex-girlfriend, Candace Cunningham, also murdered. Great attributed his motives to government assistance, writing, "They were already dead, just their bodies were flopping wherever it can flop, but their minds were already dead. The state took their minds." Once they started receiving their monthly checks, Great was sentenced to death and is scheduled to be executed on 19 March 2025. Number 4. Rocky Ali Beeman, 2005 to 2017. Rocky Ali Beeman was born in December of 1977. On February 6, 2005, Rocky Beeman and his girlfriend, Karen Wilkins, murdered mother Debbie Lacey. Beeman hit Lacey, tied her hands behind her back, and held her in water until she drowned. They then took her car and traded it in for cocaine. To avoid the death sentence, Beeman pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Whilst in prison, Beeman realized his apprehension for criminals who hurt children. Thus, 7 years later, on the 5th of July 2012, Beeman choked fellow inmate, 44-year-old Brian Huntsiker, in the prison showers and stabbed him over 80 times with a shank until he died. Huntsiker was serving 6 life terms for sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl in 2001 and for molesting a 5-year-old girl in 1992. Then 5 years later, on the 22nd of January 2017, Beeman strangled and slit the throat of another inmate, 27-year-old Nicholas Anderson. Anderson was in jail serving a 20-year sentence for child molestation. It seemed that Beeman wanted the death penalty. In a letter addressed to a judge, he wrote that killing sex offenders was the best feeling I've had in a long time, and if you don't send me to death row, I vow to dedicate my next killing to you. In November of 2019, Beeman got what he wanted and was sentenced to death. However, whilst on death row awaiting execution. He died by suicide on the 10th of June 2020 in a Florida prison. Number 3. Retta Phyllis Mays, 2017 to 2018. Retta Phyllis Mays was born in 1975 in Reynoldsville in West Virginia. She was a United States Army veteran, but at the time of the murders, she worked as a nursing assistant at the Louis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. In 2017, Mays was assigned to work overnight shifts, and simultaneously, elderly patients began suffering mysterious acute drops in blood sugar levels and dying. Because of this, the hospital began an internal investigation of 11 deaths. The investigation was turned over to the FBI, and Mays was fired from the hospital, whilst the 2-year-long investigation took place. It was discovered that Mays enjoyed researching female serial killers and watching Netflix series such as Nurses Will Kill. Ultimately, investigators found that during her time at the medical center, Mays would inject elderly patients with insulin so as to cause acute drops in their blood sugar levels and their eventual deaths. She did this in order to end their suffering and enable them to pass away gently. And she also noted that because of her tumultuous personal life, these murders gave her a sense of control. Even though there were up to 20 suspicious deaths in the time Mays was working, she was only charged with 7 second-degree murders and 1 count of intent to commit murder due to insufficient evidence for the other deaths. On 11 May 2021, Mays received 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. She was also ordered to pay the victims' families $172,624.96. Her known victims, all veterans, were 84-year-old Archie Edgell, 82-year-old Robert Edge, 89-year-old Robert Colzo, 81-year-old George Shaw Sr., 96-year-old William Halloway, 82-year-old Felix McDermott, 88-year-old Raymond Golden, and 92-year-old Russell R. Posey. Number 2. Ramon Alberto Escobar, 2018. Although originally from El Salvador, Ramon Alberto Escobar committed his crimes in Texas and California in 2018. Born in 1971 and having grown up in poverty, Escobar entered America in the 1980s, and between then and 2017, he committed and was charged for crimes such as burglary, assault, and trespassing, and was deported by ICE over 6 times. However, in 2017, Escobar applied for political asylum and became a permanent resident of America. After one of his arrests in 2000, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Despite his criminal behavior, Escobar was not known to be violent and was someone whose community spoke warmly about. However, on the 26th of August 2018 in Texas, during an argument with his 65-year-old uncle, Rogelio, in which his uncle belittled him, Escobar bludgeoned him to death with a baton. His 60-year-old aunt, Dina, soon became suspicious of her brother's disappearance, and so 2 days later, Escobar strangled her to death to avoid being caught out. However, Escobar was detained and questioned by the police 2 days later, but having no evidence against him, they let him go. Escobar then fled to Los Angeles, where he became homeless. On 8 September 2018, Escobar attacked and killed 51-year-old Juan Ramirez, a fellow homeless man who fell into a 3-year-long coma before passing away in 2021. From there, Escobar attacked and killed other homeless men, 24-year-old Braden Rideout and 59-year-old Kelvin Williams, with a baseball bat. On the 20th, he attacked and killed 39-year-old Stephen Ray Cruz Jr., who actually lived with his parents and was just out fishing. His final victim on 24 September 2018 was 63-year-old Jorge Martinez, who he again beat with a baseball bat, causing him to slip into a coma from which he would pass away. Escobar was caught by the police soon after this and ultimately charged with 6 counts of murder, including his aunt and uncle in Texas, 5 counts of attempted murder, and 4 counts of robbery. Escobar's motive for the murders were personal animosity and financial hardship. Escobar was found fit to stand trial, and after accepting a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on May 6, 2022. Number 1. Kenyell William Brown, 2019 to 2020. Kenyatta William Brown was a 40-year-old man from River Rock, Michigan. As a teenager and into his adulthood, he began doing drugs and was in and out of prison for crimes such as attack with a weapon, selling drugs, illegal possession of a taser, multiple parole violations, and for a hit and run in which someone died. However, regardless of the severity of his crimes, he was always released from prison ahead of the completion of his sentence because he was also employed as an FBI informant since the late 90s. On 7 December 2019, Brown shot dead 31-year-old Lauren Harrington. 2 months later, he shot and killed 52-year-old Kimberly Green and 48-year-old Dorian Patterson. After he became suspected of these 3 murders, his status as an FBI and police informant was revoked. Whilst an arrest warrant was out for Brown, he shot and killed 49-year-old Garcias Woodyard and 41-year-old Amir Thaxton, who was also a friend of his. His last known victim on the 22nd of February was 36-year-old Eugene Jennings. All his murders were believed to be robbery, money, or drug-related and took place over the period of 3 months in 3 cities in Wayne County, Michigan. Brown was never charged for the murder of these 6 victims because on the 24th of February 2020, whilst police were trying to arrest him, he shot himself in the head and died 4 days later in the hospital. Top 5 Most Recent American Female Serial Killers. Number 1. Retta Phyllis Mays, 2017 to 2018. Retta Phyllis Mays was a 42-year-old United States Army veteran who at the time of the murders worked as a nursing assistant at the Louis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. In 2017, Mays was assigned to work overnight shifts and simultaneously elderly patients began suffering mysterious acute drops in blood sugar levels and dying. Because of this, the hospital began an internal investigation of 11 deaths before turning the investigation over to the FBI. Ultimately, investigators found that Mays would inject elderly patients with insulin so as to cause acute drops in their blood sugar levels and their eventual deaths. She reasoned that she did this in order to end their suffering and enable them to pass away gently. Even though there were up to 20 suspicious deaths in the time Mays was working, she was only charged with 7 second-degree murders and 1 count of intent to commit murder due to insufficient evidence of the other deaths. In 2021, Mays received 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. Before we continue, hit the subscribe button. Number 2. Megan Huntsman, 1996 to 2006. In 2014, Darren West, the then husband of 39-year-old Megan Huntsman, was cleaning out his garage in Pleasant Grove, Utah, when he discovered a small white box wrapped in plastic. In the box, he discovered the decomposing body of a baby. He continued to look through his garage and discovered 7 more babies in various stages of decay. Darren West and Megan Huntsman had 3 children together. However, they were drug addicts and West was prone to be violent towards Huntsman, even serving time in jail from 2006 to 2014. Forensic testing showed that the 7 babies belonged to West and Huntsman. One of the 7 had been stillborn, but Huntsman pleaded guilty to having strangled or suffocated the rest to death as soon as she had given birth to them. No one ever knew that she was pregnant, not even West. When she would go into labor, she would deliver discreetly and alone so as not to draw attention of the others. Huntsman's defense was that she didn't want the babies, and for these murders, she received 6 counts of 5 years to life in prison. Number 3. Vicky Don Jackson. In December of 2000, patients at the Nocona General Hospital in Texas who had only minor illnesses began dying mysteriously. The hospital's administrator then began to notice that during a particular shift, vials of muscle-relaxing medicine, which when overdosed, halts breathing, were going missing. By February of 2001, the hospital began locking the drug away and police investigations commenced. It was ultimately discovered that licensed vocational nurse Vicky Don Jackson was responsible for overdosing patients with this drug when they, according to her, became too demanding and fussy. Exhumations and investigations revealed that she had likely killed up to 10 patients between the ages of 62 and 100 years of age in a 3-month period by administering them with a lethal dose of the drug. Jackson pleaded no contest to 10 capital murder charges and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 4. Kristen Gilbert, 1989 to 1996. In 1989, 22-year-old nurse Kristen Gilbert joined the staff of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. During her shifts, patients would die mysteriously and her colleagues jokingly called her the Angel of Death. However, in 1996, 3 fellow nurses reported being concerned about the high number of patients who died from cardiac arrest and how certain drugs seemed to be in short supply after Gilbert's shifts. This report began a police investigation which ultimately revealed that Gilbert would inject adrenaline into patients' intravenous therapy bags, causing them to go into cardiac arrest. Gilbert would then swoop in and half the time resuscitate and save the patients' lives. It was discovered that she did this to assert her prowess as a nurse and also to get the attention of her love interest and ex-boyfriend, who was a hospital police officer, as it was required that hospital police be present in a room in which medical emergencies were taking place. It is estimated that Gilbert was responsible for over 350 deaths during her 7 years at the hospital, but she was only convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder, and was given 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years. Before we continue, hit the subscribe button. Number 5. Donna Perry, 1990. Donna Perry is a transgender woman who was born male and known as Douglas Perry before she transitioned in the year 2000. Douglas had a difficult childhood and grew to lead a life of crime such as reckless endangerment, being in possession of a pipe bomb, 49 guns, 20,000 rounds of ammunition, and solicitation. During an 18-month stint in prison in 1990, Perry boasted to his cellmate that he had killed 9 sex workers over a 4-month period in Washington state earlier that year, but nothing came of this confession. However, in March of 2012, well after Douglas had transitioned to Donna, she was arrested for firearm possession and had to have her DNA submitted to a national database. Her DNA immediately linked her to the 1990 murders of 3 sex workers. During her trial, Donna insisted that she was not guilty because it had been Douglas that had shot and killed the women and that she had taken pains to get gender confirmation surgery as a permanent way to control violence. However, the prosecution argued that Donna Perry only underwent reassignment surgery in order to avoid suspicion of her crimes, and she was ultimately sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe. Top 5 Most Recent American Medical Serial Killers. Number 5. Billy Shamirmir, 1 victim. Billy Shamirmir is a nurse who's accused of the murders of elderly women in Dallas, Texas and its surrounding suburbs. It is suspected that he had been active since 2016 when he was caught trespassing on Edgemere Retirement Community. Shamirmir is accused of using his healthcare experience to pose as a medical professional to gain access to the properties of at least 22 elderly women before smothering them with a pillow. Billy would then proceed to steal valuables including cash and jewelry from the elderly women, especially going for residents of upscale assisted living facilities, among them the Tradition Prestonwood. So far, Shamirmir has been convicted of the murder of Luthi Harris and has been sentenced to life in prison. Dallas County District Attorney did not seek a death sentence for Shamirmir. However, Shamirmir could still face execution on pending capital murder charges in Collin County. As of July 2022, Shamirmir has been indicted for 22 murders and is also facing 6 civil suits, accusing him of similar charges. Number 4. Kristen Gilbert, 4 victims. Kristen Heather Gilbert is a former nurse who was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders at the Veterans Affairs Clinic in Northampton, Massachusetts. She induced cardiac arrest in patients by injecting their intravenous bags with massive doses of adrenaline. She would then respond to the coded emergency, often resuscitating the patient herself. In other instances, she would request that another nurse checks on the patient first before she would swoop in to save the day. Gilbert was on duty for about half of the 350 deaths that occurred at the hospital between 1989 and 1996. Kristen was nicknamed the Angel of Death, and she was first reported when other nurses noticed an increase in cardiac arrest deaths and a decrease in the supply of epinephrine at the hospital. An investigation ensued. The result of the investigation led to Kristen, who was convicted for the murders of her 4 victims and is now serving 4 consecutive life terms. Number 3. Kimberly Sines, 5 victims. Kimberly Sines, also known as Kimberly Clockfowler, is a former licensed practical nurse who was convicted of killing 5 patients at a Texas dialysis center by injecting bleach into their dialysis lines. In 2008, the clinic she was working at had an unusual spike in patients falling seriously ill during their treatment. Paramedics were called a record 30 times to the clinic in April 2008 alone. The owners of the facility sent one of their clinical coordinators to find out what was wrong after 2 patients had died of cardiac arrest in quick succession. 2 patients subsequently testified that they saw Signs draw a bleach solution into 2 syringes, then inject the substance into other patients' dialysis lines. This led to Signs being confronted, under which circumstances she claimed she was cleaning an unused dialysis machine and used a syringe to get a precise measurement, a method that was contrary to company policy. Police were called in and the clinic was shut down for 2 weeks after several syringes used by Signs tested positive for bleach. On March 31, 2012, an Angelina County jury convicted Signs of murdering 5 patients and injuring 5 others. Signs was sentenced to 5 concurrent terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Number 2. Retta Phyllis Mays. 7 victims. Retta Phyllis Mays was born in 1975 in Reynoldsville in West Virginia. She was a United States Army veteran, but at the time of the murders, she worked as a nursing assistant at the Louis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia. In 2017, Mays was assigned to work overnight shifts, and simultaneously, elderly patients began suffering mysterious acute drops in blood sugar levels and dying. Because of this, the hospital began an internal investigation of 11 deaths. The investigation was turned over to the FBI and Mays was fired from the hospital, whilst the 2-year-long investigation took place. It was discovered that Mays enjoyed researching female serial killers and watching Netflix series such as Nurses Will Kill. Ultimately, investigators found that during her time at the medical center, Mays would inject elderly patients with insulin so as to cause acute drops in their blood sugar levels and their eventual deaths. She did this in order to end their suffering and enable them to pass away gently. And she also noted that because of her tumultuous personal life, these murders gave her a sense of control. Even though there were up to 20 suspicious deaths in the time Mays was working, she was only charged with 7 second-degree murders and 1 count of intent to commit murder due to insufficient evidence for the other deaths. On 11 May 2021, Mays received 7 consecutive life sentences plus 20 years. She was also ordered to pay the victims' families $172,624.96. Her known victims, all veterans, were 84-year-old Archie Edgell, 82-year-old Robert Edge, 89-year-old Robert Colzo, 81-year-old George Shaw Sr., 96-year-old William Halloway, 82-year-old Felix McDermott, 88-year-old Raymond Golden, and 92-year-old Russell R. Posey. Number 1. Elizabeth Wetlaufa, 8 victims. Wetlaufa is a former registered nurse who confessed to murdering 8 senior citizens and attempting to murder 6 others in southwestern Ontario between 2007 and 2016. Wetlaufa injected all her victims with insulin, and her first fatality was on August 11, 2007, when she murdered James Silcox, an 84-year-old World War II veteran and father of 6. Through March 2014, Wetlaufa murdered 6 more patients by injecting them with insulin at Crescent Care Home. She also injected 2 others with intent to murder. She confessed to 2 counts of attempted murder for these cases. Wetlaufa left employment at Crescent Care in 2014, but was in part-time work at other facilities and other patients' homes, where she injected 3 more people with insulin. Wetlaufa entered an inpatient drug rehabilitation program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, a hospital in Toronto, on September 16, 2016, where she confessed to killing her patients, leading to the police being informed. After providing police with a 2-hour-long confession, she was formally charged with 8 murders on October 25. On June 26, 2017, she was sentenced to 8 concurrent life terms in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years.